In September 1906, Cosmopolitan magazine wrote an article addressing a serious issue of the time. It told a tale of a Native American chieftain that was visiting the grand city of New York. The sights included the Brooklyn Bridge, towering buildings, whimsical circuses, and poor people huddled in masses. When asked what surprised him the most about his visit, the chieftain sadly replied with 3 simple words: "Little children working."
The National Child Labor Committee and Lewis Hine, focusing a lens on child labor. In the early 1900s, America's social reform movement of the Progressive Era took a critical view of the issue of child labor. The Industrial Revolution changed the picture of labor in the United States. Children went to work in mills, coal mines, glass factories, and sweatshops, often in dangerous and unsafe conditions.
The National Child Labor Committee, led by Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, and Lillian Wald, took a stand to end the use of children in the workforce and require free compulsory education for all children. This committee commissioned photographer Lewis Hine to crisscross the American landscape to capture the images of children at work and focus America's attention and ire on this abuse of our youth.
For generations, it was commonplace that children were a part of the family workforce. Children were expected to help out with chores, farming, or family businesses. Since children were not required to attend school regularly, families put their children to work at a very young age. Parents felt that this was a way to keep them out of trouble, and they could earn additional income for their families.
However, at the turn of the 20th century, the term child labor started to take on a new meaning. Michael Schumann of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics states,
There's always been some child labor, but the fact you had these machines that could be operated just fairly simply by children really increased the potential for child labor.
As industrialization moved workers from farms into factories, children were often preferred because they were viewed as more manageable, cheaper, and less likely to strike.
During the Industrial Revolution, from the 18th to 19th centuries, our country saw rural populations migrate from farm communities to factory work in the cities for a better life. Industrialization allowed for a shift to powered machinery, and the factory owners benefited with these technological advances. The use of child labor added to their rising profits because children were a much cheaper source of labor.
As the Industrial Revolution made its way into the American landscape, factories, mines, sweatshops, and street vendors started to appear. With these new businesses, there was an ever-present need for more labor, especially child labor. Children were seen as cheap candidates for some of the most dangerous and tedious work. This new movement caused child labor to take on a new, controversial look that would forever change what childhood meant to many children.
Child labor was seen everywhere in America. The census of 1890 showed nearly 20%, or 1.5 million children ages 10 to 15 were working. The number grew to 1.75 million with the census of 1900 and totaled over 2 million children by 1910.
Employing children had many advantages for these big businesses. Since children were small in size, they could work in very tiny spaces where larger adults could not fit. Most children could be controlled easily because they weren't brave enough to challenge an adult's directive, let alone strike because of poor wages or working conditions. Finally, the biggest reason that children were an important labor source is because they earned significantly less money than an adult. A child would work up to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, and still only bring home as low as $1 in wages.
Additionally, these child laborers barely experienced their youth. Going to school to prepare for a better future was an opportunity these underage workers rarely enjoyed. Furman Owens was only 12 years old when he said, "Yes, I want to learn, but can't when I work all the time."
Besides being deprived in education, these children also began to suffer from serious health problems. They developed fatal diseases related to their work environments, such as tuberculosis and pneumonia. They faced high accident rates due to physical and mental fatigue. Not only did the children suffer greatly, but the United States was being robbed of the future potential of millions of children who become uneducated, ill-prepared citizens.
In 1904, a group of progressive reformers took a stand and founded the National Child Labor Committee, an organization whose goal was the abolition of child labor. The NCLC was chartered in 1907 by an act of Congress with a board of directors including prominent progressive reformers such as Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, and Lillian Wald. With the leadership of such important reformers, the organization quickly began to attract additional support and move towards action and advocacy.
The NCLC's goal was to work with state child labor committees to introduce legislation to try and regulate child labor. Pamphlets, posters, and flyers were printed to educate the people of the evils of child labor. But unfortunately, these materials were not driving the change for which the NCLC had hoped.
In order to strengthen and publicize its stand against child labor, the NCLC then hired photographer Hine in 1908 to document child labor abuses. The goal was to turn the tide of public opinion against child labor and to intensify the NCLC's stand. Hine traveled all over the United States to photograph this hidden abuse of children and said, "If I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need to lug around this camera. Photography can light up darkness and expose ignorance."
Documenting the stand against powerful businesses was extremely dangerous. Hine was frequently threatened with violence by factory foremen. The immorality of child labor was meant to be hidden from the public. Therefore, photography was prohibited because of the serious threat it posed to the industry.
Hine captured the misery of children working in all kinds of industries and conditions: the dirty textile mills, night shifts in dark glass factories, hours in dusty coal mines, and children shucking in cold, damp buildings. These photos showed the outside world why a powerful stand against child labor was desperately needed.
The NCLC organized displays with statistics and Hine's photographs to dramatize the plight of these children. As Michael Schumann with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistic notes, Hine mobilized public opinion with his photographs by exposing many unseen conditions.
After that, making the pictures, make the situation look very sympathetic to people on the outside. So I think that really helped mobilize public opinion, because a lot of what people may have seen was the newsies handing out newspapers on the corner if you're in an urban area, but you may not have seen the children in the mines. You wouldn't have seen the age of some of the children when they were working elsewhere, and the conditions that they were in without Louis Hine.
These efforts resulted in the establishment of the Children's Bureau in 1912, signed into law by President Taft.
The committee continued its slow and tedious work in trying to pass legislation. Its successful stand in ending child labor and replacing it with free compulsory education relied heavily on the political climate. It thought it had achieved success in 1916 and 1918 with the passage of several federal child labor laws, only to be disappointed when these laws were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Then again, in 1924, another labor amendment failed in Congress.
Starting in the 1930s, however, a favorable political climate was made possible by several forces at work. The Great Depression made it almost impossible for adults to find work, creating even less demand for child workers. Labor unions also became more powerful and pushed to end children in the workforce.
Unions worked very hard to demand legislation that brought about an end to child labor.
Additionally, machine complexity increased, therefore requiring a more educated person to operate the equipment efficiently. Also, the government now required children to attend school longer and enforce tougher truancy laws. All of these forces were very instrumental in bringing an end to child labor.
Success was finally realized in 1938 when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. Now there were finally federal standards defining a national minimum wage, hour standards, and child labor practices. These laws, passed over 75 years ago, are still in place today to protect American children and laborers of all ages.
The National Child Labor Committee took a stand over a century ago to end the use of children in the workforce and focused the nation's attention on the abuse of vulnerable children. History recognizes that this stand was essential in creating the momentum and change that was needed to take children out of the workforce. Society finally realized that compulsory education was the only way to ensure a brighter future for generations of Americans.